These are glyphs, Glyph, like a hieroglyph. It's a shape or a collection of shapes that can represent some information. In this case, they don't represent any information, they're just kind of cool looking, and there are trillions of them. The way that the permutations, the different style elements, I call them. So like if you see triangles in there, that's a style element. If it's pointed up, that's one style. If it's pointed down, that's another style. And then sometimes they're outlined and filled, and they seem to be appearing in certain parts of the square. So there are rules to making my glyph, and all those rules, when you add them all together, it makes trillions and trillions and trillions of combinations. It's just an incredibly huge number of different objects that we can make with this program that I'm going to show you. But before I show you the program, I kind of want to go into how each glyph is made so that it makes more sense when I go through this program line for line. So let's look at how a glyph is made. We can see each glyph is made from a square, and that square is made from smaller squares, 4x4 grid. That grid is divided into 3 zones, A, B, and C. There's the corner zones, the inside zone, and then the edge zones. You can put certain objects in those zones. Not every object will go in any zone randomly. There's an order to it. So we can see on the left, here's our different objects, our primitives, and the strokes that we'll use to drop inside the square randomly. And then we can color them in different ways to increase the randomness. And then there's ways that we can get random numbers to make it even more interesting. So that's kind of how you make a glyph. And if you want to reference this, just skip back, note the time, skip back, and you can reference this diagram here. That will help you in understanding this program if you have any problems. Let's get started with making the program. Very first thing we do is set up our new sketch in the p5.js editor. I guess the very first thing you do is learn how to type. And sometimes it's hard to get started. I think once I get warmed up, I'll be okay. So we want to create a canvas that is the available window width and the window height. And, we're not going to worry about the background or draw so much yet. We will get to that when it's time. The very first thing we want to do is think about what we're doing here. We're going to make an object, and that object is going to do some stuff inside of it, and then we're going to move this object position across the canvas from top to bottom, and then print a glyph one after the other, kind of like you're typing letters on a typewriter. So that's kind of the action that we want to encompass in this code here. So the very first thing we need to do is create a variable that will hold that object that we want to create. This object is going to contain a lot of randomness. How we're going to select the glyphs, what colors they're going to appear or not. We're going to be using this randomness again and again, so it might be best to make a function to handle that separately. So let's create a variable that will hold that object. We want something to hold the size of this object so it's easy to change things. If we want a character or a glyph that's 100 pixels, well, we can just change this here and that will do that, which is something when you finish this program and you want to play around with it, it's going to be easier to just adjust these few variables here to do a lot of different things. Since we're moving this object across the screen in Draw, that's kind of where the action of printing our glyphs is going to occur, is in Draw. We need some global variables to handle the position. So I'm going to set X pause and Y pause to 0 for now, and then we can work with that later in Draw. In setup, this is where we're going to have to instantiate the objects that we need to work with. So we have an object that creates the glyph, and then we have an object that gets random numbers. So let's start with get random numbers. And then if we're instantiating our glyph object, if we need random numbers during the instantiation, we have the object to do that. I don't think I actually call this object in the function, the instantiation part, so it doesn't really matter, but if we keep track of the order of things, it gives us a little bit of advantage in case we want to change stuff in the future. So I want my X position to be 0, and I want my Y position, it has to be a little special. Why does that look like this? Okay. The Y position is a little special. We need to go down a little bit to start. We're going to go down the height of a glyph plus a fraction to give it some space. And that's what that is. So we're going down 1 whole unit of our glyph size times 10% or plus 10% of that. Let's do our background here, and then if we need to refresh the background or leave it the same or whatever, we can handle that in draw. But if we omit it in draw, at least we've cleared the background once in setup. So that's what that's doing. It's at least starting with the fresh background at some point. Now I'm kind of missing something in here because oh yeah, I have my random object. Now I need my glyph. I'm going to call that that function Glyphmaker, and I'm going to pass into it the size that we set our object in this part up here. So I'm sending that variable into it. And I also need something else here. Oh yeah, I need to set up some of the graphic attributes. So when I draw these style elements, I'm going to be drawing them from the corner. For me, it just seemed to work out mathematically. If I do it from the corner, then I do it from the center. Either way, it's probably the same amount of work. But I just conceptually, I worked from the corner of my objects when I drop them inside the rectangle. So to do that, I'm going to set the rectangle mode, rec mode, to corner. And I want my strokes to end in a certain way. I don't want them to be truncated. I don't want them to be rounded. So I'm going to set the stroke cap to project, and then that should line up everything well so that I guess they miter nicely is the word I'm looking for, maybe. So stroke cap set there. I think that's everything for setup. Now we're ready to move into draw. Let me clean up this a little bit. So down in draw, let's give ourselves some space. And I'm going to just take this out for now. And if we need it, we'll put it back in later. Just to slow things down for debugging, I'm going to put frame rate in here. That'll let us see if the style elements are going down in the right spot or not, because we could miss key. I probably will miss key. I'll try to do my best to be careful about it, but if that happens, if it's slower, we can see whether it's working or not. So let's just drop that in there. We can comment it out later once everything's working well. I want to use a local variable to set the glyph size to, just so I don't have to work with all this. It's kind of unwieldy. It's a lot easier to just use the variable size. So let's use that there. And then we can add to our X position the size of that glyph times 1.1. So that's going to do that same action of moving it over its width plus a little bit as a kind of a margin. We want to test the bounds for that to make sure that everything's cool. So let's do a test against the width, and we want to give ourselves some margin on the left and right. So we'll just subtract the size of our glyph from the width, and if we're past that, we'll just reset. So we're past the right hand side. Let's reset the X position back to the left hand side, but we want a little bit of margin there too, so we're just going to add the size of the glyph plus that little bit of that sliver of margin. And if we're resetting the X, that means we can advance the Y position. So let's do that here. Oh, what am I doing? Having a little bit of an issue with my eyes today. And that's not all. So our X is past the right hand side, we've reset the X, we've advanced the Y. We need to check and see if the Y is out of bounds now. Same procedure, we're going to give ourselves some margins. And if it is past that, then we're just going to reset it back to the top with a little bit of margin. We can also, right here in this part, we can stop the program after one pass. So it's moved all from the top to the bottom of the screen. It's getting ready to go back to the top. We can stop the program there and then have a look at what we've created. We can comment that out later and do all kinds of stuff, but for now I'm just going to put that in there. You may want to at the end add a comment like save canvas here and store your image as a JPEG or a PNG or something like that. So there are a lot of different ways that we can put our style elements together. So we need to think about that in this section here. Once we've found the position to drop a glyph, we're ready to make one. But how do we do that? We're getting some random numbers, but what do those mean? So my idea is I'm going to have an array, a set of style elements, and then I'll just turn those true or false. So I'm going to set all of them to false to begin with, and then I can just randomly turn some on and then run through those and print the style elements that are on. So that's kind of like the procedural idea. That's not complete, but that's just the general idea that I'm working with here. So if I do that, there's two ways I can do it. I can just run through each element in sequence, check and see if it's on, turn it on, display it, but you're going to get an order of layers. One idea might be to take so many chances of any one of them being on in any order and then cycle through a number of those randomly. Maybe it could be 10 or 20 chances, and then you can randomly select the glyphs in any order and then lay them down that way. So there's two ways that we can do this. I thought the unordered or random layering would be the best way, so I'm going to call that B. B is going to want in draw, it's going to want me to cycle through so many chances. If I use the other method where we go through the layers of, then I can do all of that inside the method. But to step outside of that layer ordering, I need to put a loop in draw that will run through so many chances. So one of the variables that I need to start doing that is a local variable that will hold the density. How many chances do I want for the glyphs to be printed? In other words, how many different glyphs do I want to show at any time? I don't maybe want to set this to a fixed value. I might want it to be random so that some glyphs might have one style in them and others might be completely full of styles. So I want this range of variability for the output. So one of the things that I can do is just create a random variable, set it to, create some random value, set it to a local variable. So that's what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to call it dense. So I'm picking a number between 1, so there's going to be at least one object in, or one style element in our glyph, at least. And then I'm going to look at how many different style elements are there. And I'm going to pick about half of those have a chance of being displayed. And I say about half because if you're choosing these randomly, there's a chance you'll pick one twice or 3 times. So you're going to have a maximum of so many, given none are selected twice. And then that will diminish if some are multiples and layered over the top of one another. Like if I draw a top triangle and then I draw some other objects in my glyph and then I go back to the top triangle again and put that down, we're not going to really know there's 2 triangles there. You're just going to see one in the end. So if you're counting the style elements, you're not going to, that one's not going to figure into the count. So it's going to be at least half the glyph length. That's going to be the maximum number. And then if there's any duplicates, it'll diminish it a little bit. And that's going to happen, and that's kind of a set amount of times that will happen. So I figure just half the number of style elements might be a good density. You can play around with this and maybe a quarter of them or 75% of them, but half is a good place to start. So dense is going to hold this random number, and it's a floor value for some reason. I'm not sure. I think it's just because I have it on a loop and it works out better that way. So let's put this in that loop. I call it V arbitrarily because I didn't want to use X, Y, or Z, or W, or H, or any of the other standard single letter variables that I use as a standard. So I just went backwards, Z, Y, X, W, V, and just used that one. So inside this loop, V, it's going to go through that loop the dense number of times, and inside it, it's going to we're going to push and pop, because each time we draw a stroke element, we want to stay on that glyph shape. We don't want to translate off of it. So we're going to put each cycle through an individual style element inside this push and pop. We're going to get a random number, and inside this function, I'm going to make two methods, one called make A and one called make B. We're going to use make B. I'm going to add make A because you might want to play around with that later on and do things differently, and it's just nice to add it. It doesn't take a whole lot to do, and it's there if you need it. So for now, we're just going to use make B, and we're going to call the glyph object. Inside the glyph object, there is a function called, there will be when we make it, called show. And we're going to pass into that the location that we want this glyph to occur at, and we're going to send into it this density value. So I think that's all of that's all of the draw. So let's clean this up a little bit. Let's look at what we have in draw. We have a way to slow things down so we can see what's going on. We have a global variable that makes it easier to work with the size of our glyph. Then we're moving it a glyph with each cycle. If we get past that range, we're going to drop down and then move back. And if we get past that, we're just going to pause the draw loop, or the draw function. After all that testing, and we know what our position is going to be, we have a global variable that sets the number of style elements that are going to be in our glyph. We're going to cycle through that loop, and then we're going to get random style elements, and then we're going to show those. So that's everything that's happening in draw. Since we make the get random function, since we call that first, I'm just going to make that first. It's pretty easy to do. The function that handles making the style elements is pretty lengthy. It's not terribly complicated, but there are like 23 different style elements, and each has its own conditional statement. So it gets kind of hefty in terms of repetition, but I try to keep that down as much as I can, while at the same time trying to keep things straight and not overcomplicated or convoluted. We're going to make a function called RND parts for random parts. Some of you old school BASIC programmers may remember RND as a keyword in BASIC for making random numbers. Here in the instantiation part, there's not going to be anything. There's just going to be two methods inside this function. I did it this way just to keep things separate. The first function is make A, and then the second function is make B. So inside the make A function, it's pretty simple. We're just going to cycle through each style element and randomly determine to activate it or not. We're looping through all of the style elements, all the glyph style elements. This is an array that's going to be in the function once we make it. So it has a length. We're going to go through each one of those, and we're going to set it to true. We're turning them all on. And then we're going to decide randomly whether to turn it off. We're setting it to true here, then let's do the condition. So 50% of the time, this will be false. We're setting it to true by default, and then setting it to false according to this here. And just a side note, I used to do this in a very convoluted way. If you look at some of my old videos, I've got 2 or 3 lines added to this program that handle this right here. I did not know, and I don't know why I didn't, I should have figured it out, that you could put random in the argument for this condition statement, that you can just put that keyword in there like that. For some reason, I was under the impression that I had to assign random to a variable and then use that variable in the condition. It is so handy to just use the keyword in the condition, and then you don't have to have an extra variable or any of that. So if you've seen me use extra variables in the past, stop doing it. Do it this way, and this is a lot easier. That being said, what it's doing is it picks a random number between 0 and 1, or almost 1. And if that number is less than 0.5, it's going to set the glyph style to false, which is turned on to true here. So we're basically deciding randomly to turn these on or off. In the make_b method, it uses a density of chances to activate at random the style element before moving on to the next one. And the advantage of this method is that each style element can appear on top or below any other one with no order to the placement layering. In method A, each style's elements drawing is determined in sequence, so there's an order to the placement layering. I kind of want to avoid that. That's why I made the second B part. So in make B, we want to make a loop that goes through all of the style elements and then turns them off. If we've run through this before, they're all turned off except for one, and that's the random one we've selected to draw. We don't want to draw that one again, so let's shut that one off and then reselect another one, or select that one again randomly, whichever happens. But we want to at the very first shut any one of them off that may be on. We could keep track of the one that we turned on and then just shut that one off, but I feel like if maybe we turn a bunch of them on at one time, then we got to keep track of a bunch of things. So it's just easier to loop through the entire array and reset it than it is to do anything else. So that's kind of the approach that I took here. So here we're setting them all to false, and then once we have a clean array with all false values, let's set a global variable to a random number. We're going to call this glyph active, G active for glyph active. Let's get an integer between 0 and our number of style elements, and then we'll take that number. That's going to be an index value for our array. We'll put it in the bracket here as the argument, and we'll set that equal to true. And now that glyph style element is on. So now when we go into the Glyphmaker, it's going to know which style elements to make. It's going to go through all of its style elements. It's going to say, is this one on? Is it active? If it is, let's draw it. If it isn't, let's go down to the next one. So that's kind of the procedure we're using here. We have to create a function called Glyphmaker. So let's do that. Let's get down here where draw is. Give ourselves some room. We'll pass into Glyphmaker the size that we want our glyphs to be, and then we're going to start assigning variables here in the instantiation part. We want to set size equal to a variable that we can work with inside the function or outside the function. I want my glyph to be divided into a 4x4 grid, so I'm going to use this variable, this .unit, as a variable that will hold that number of quadrants that we're going to have. The results of the division are size divided by the number of units. That's going to be a quad. I just call it a quad just to keep it straight in my head. You might want to name it something else. So the width and height of our glyph, it's a square, so it's the same. Width is the same as the height. So I'm just going to put those two letters together in one variable called this .width height, and whenever I need to use the width or the height value, I have it all nice and neat packaged into one little variable. Here's where we start making our arrays that are going to hold the Boolean for our style element, whether it's going to be on or not. We want to cycle through the array and cycle through the list of elements, so however many we have. I think there's 24 in this. 0 to 25 or less than 25. I think 0 to this is fine. If it adds one that isn't there, it doesn't matter. We're not going to use it. I don't think it's going to hurt anything. Let's set all those style elements to false, so they're inactive to begin with. I think that's the end of the setup for this function. So we're starting with the size. We're getting, we have a way to divide that size into parts. Those parts are going to be it's not the product of division, it's the quotient of division. And then we're going to get the center with this .wh, which is going to represent kind of the half size of this object. If we need the full size, we can just multiply it times 2. But I think since we're working with the origin, using the half size is going to work just fine. We need an array to hold our style booleans, whether they're active or inactive, and then we're going to loop through so that we can give them their initial state of false. So that's all of the Glyphmaker setup. So let's make our function that actually does that. So in the show function, I'm passing into it that variable v up here. This variable v, that's going to be ECNT down here, and that's our count, how many times it's been going through the loop. If the very first time it goes through, I want to do something special. I want to lay down a rectangle that's going to cover up anything that might be there already, and then it's going to form a base for our glyph style elements to rest on, and kind of frames everything nicely. But I only want to put that down once, the first time, so that I'm not covering up every style element when it goes back through the loop. So that's going to keep track of that value. I might want to do more with that later on in the code, but that's one of the first things that value does. Inside show, we have to assign our initial graphic state. So we want the fill to be green. I'm working with green. You can do reds or orange or whatever you want. Just mix it up. Have fun with it. That's all that's important. So I want my stroke weight, the outline of these glyph style elements, to be proportional to whatever size we assign them. So if I set a glyph to 10 pixels, then the stroke is going to be really small. It's going to be 1. I think that's the smallest it can be. And then if I set it to 100 pixels, then it's going to be a pretty thick stroke, all in proportion here, and that's going to happen right there. Let's set our origin to make this object at that location that we passed into the function there, the x and y. And then let's start that looking at the initial state to see is this the first time through. If it is, let's make a rectangle the size of our glyph, which is that if we're translated to the origin now, the glyph size will be halfway to the left of the origin and then halfway to the right of the origin. You put those two halves together and it makes the full size of our glyph. So that's what we're going to do with negative and positive numbers here. So we're going to start our rectangle on the left with that half value, and then we're going to go and set the size of its width and height to the size of our glyph, and that will create the perfect rectangle to cover up anything below it and create the base for our style elements. So we have this translation here that's outside of push and pop. That's kind of setting our glyph location. This is where a glyph is happening. And then we're going to make another push and pop. So if we have anything rotating or spinning around inside there, it's going to be isolated and it's not going to move around on the canvas. It's going to move around inside the glyph. So let's do our push and pop and isolate stuff. So we're ready to move on to all the style elements. And instead of typing in the 23 or 24 different style element conditions with you, I thought I'd just go through them section by section real quick, because a lot of them are similar, and it would be too much time in the video and too much of your time. I think it'd just be easier if I showed you, and then if you needed to type it out, just pause, type that out, then go back, and if you needed explained, then follow the explanation. It's not too terribly difficult to figure out. So the very first thing we want to do when we create a style element is we want to look at what the index value is, which is this value here. We're going to look at the style element's Boolean, and if it's true, we're going to draw it. If it's not, we're going to skip down to the next condition. So that's kind of how we're setting this up. And then inside the condition, we're going to translate to that zone in the square that we are making for our glyph. It's divided into 4 quads, 4x4 sections, and that's divided into little zones. So we're going to follow the zones and translate to where we need to, and I'm going to annotate each one of those conditions so that you can see what's happening. The idea is that we want to just draw our geometry, set the variables for our geometry, and then translate to wherever that needs to be drawn, so that we can copy the conditional statements, and then all we have to do is change the translation. We don't have to change much else in each condition. And then there's another function inside each condition that's going to be filling it or doing its stroke colors and stuff like that. So let's look at this first top horizontal line. We're looking at the style element Boolean. If it's true, we're going to isolate the graphics transformation. So when we go to fill it, it's going to change the fill and the stroke. We want it to be associated only with this element. And then when we go down here, it's going to handle its stroke and fill differently, and we don't want it to get confused with any transformation that's happened before. So we're just going to keep things on their own inside the push and pop. For the top horizontal line, we're going to translate to 0. Remember, we've translated to the X position and the Y position that we've figured out in draw. We've sent that into the function, and now that's the origin. That's 0 is 0, 0 is now our X and Y position. So when I say 0, that's where the glyph's top left-hand corner is located. So we're drawing everything from the corners. That's going to be important later on when we start translating, which we're doing now, I guess, so it's important now. So we're at the left edge with the 0 here. To get to the top of the glyph, we want to subtract the half the width of the glyph. So that's going to take us to the top. I don't know why I do it that way. I'm not sure why I did it that way. I could have used 0 here and just, I don't know why I'm working from the Y center and then the corner. It doesn't matter. This is just the way that it is. Learn how to code confused. Anyway, we're branching to the function that fills it, and then we're going to draw our line. And our line is going to be drawn from, if the X is at 0, then it seems like my line is going from the center to the left side at the top now, because this has been translated to the top, and then it's going to the left or to the right hand side, and it's still at the top. So that's a top line. Right here we're translating down to the bottom. So this was negative, now this is positive. So if that was the top, now this is the bottom. Draw the same line, same coordinates, and it's going to put it at the bottom. We use that process for the left and right vertical line. So now we're translating to the left edge. We're at the very top of our object. We're going to draw a line from 0, 0. We're going to make that line the size of our object. This is how I probably should have translated the other ones, but it doesn't matter. Then we're just going to copy this. You can copy paste this, change the annotation, change this to a 3, and change the translation. Now we're going from the negatives to the positives. So now this is a positive number. So we're on the right hand side, and we're still starting at the very top of the object and drawing the line down. So this is still a negative, and we're using the same coordinates for our line, and it's just drawing it in a new translated location. So those are our border lines our first 4 glyphs. Now let's take a look at this. Hopefully I'll remember to switch back. So we have these zones that we're working with. We just did the outside borders with our lines. Now we have primitive shapes to put in these different zones. We're going to start with zone A, the corners, and we can put squares or circles in those corners. So let's do that. The left top corner circle square style element, I know it's a lot, that's number 4, and I have a stroke weight in here, but I don't think I need that, so I'm just going to take that out. We're going to the fillet function, so we know how it's going to be, how its appearance will be. Then we're going to translate to the top left corner of that square that's in the corner, and then we're going to draw our object, which is drawn from its corners. Everything's drawn from the corners. Don't ask me why I did it that way. It just made sense in my brain. I felt like the math would be easier that way. Turns out it wasn't. It's about the same. So anyway, we're translating to that corner, the left corner, at the top. Then we're going to determine a random chance, 50-50 chance of whether or not this is going to be a circle or it's going to be a square. And then we're going to draw that circle. Its radius is 1/2 of the size of that square. So we're going to take half of the quad. We're going to put that circle in that position, and then we're going to draw it the size of the quad, just a little bit smaller so that it doesn't overhang the corners. So when we draw a glyph, it doesn't have these geometries hanging off the edge. So that's why we got all this math here. And the rectangle is real easy. We just draw that at the 0, 0, which has been translated to here, and we draw it the size of one of those quads, those 1/4 units. Just copy that again and change the style number to 5. And now we're going from the left to the right. So this was a negative value, now it's a positive value, and we're starting at the corner, the left corner of the very last quad square. So to get there, we just add from the center of our glyph 1 quad, and then it's going to put us at the beginning of the next quad. So that's why we're using quad there instead of the WH. Sometimes it switches back and forth, and it just depends on where we're starting at in this glyph. Okay, and then the circle and the coordinates here stay the same for that. So then just copy and paste, do the left, change this to 6. Now we're left bottom, so we're going to use the X coordinate that we used for the left one here, and then we just change the Y coordinate to a bottom position. Left bottom. Left bottom. Okay. So right here is the bottom position, or plus 1 quad. It's going to set us at the corner of the very last quad. So then it's on the outside corner, right? Same with the right bottom corner. You're just going to, this is a positive number now, and it's the quad because we're adding 1 square unit to the center to get to the very beginning of the last square. Same coordinates in our circle and our rectangle. So now the left top inside square, is that what I had? Bottom, left, bottom, inside. Okay, these are the inside squares. This is a different zone now. Let's look at that and see what we got. This is zone B, the inside squares. So to get there, we're just subtracting the quad square size. So the top left inside circle square is going to be this translation, and then we just put in the same circle and rectangle coordinates because we're already translated to where we need to be. Copy that one, change this value here to 9, and now we're translating to the right, which is starting at the very center of our object, which is translated to 0 here. And it's going to be above the center line, so we're just going to subtract 1 quad width or height from our Y. Same coordinates for our circle and our rectangle. And just rinse and repeat. We're changing this to 10. We're going to find our bottom inside. We're starting to figure out how these coordinates are working now. And then for the right side. And the right side, if you'll notice, the corner, the top left corner for the right bottom inner square is 0, 0. So that may help you understand how working with the corners gets things to where they need to be. So once we get done with our inside squares, and we can do our back diagonal, which is right here, pretty simple, and our forward diagonal. We're just drawing a line. We're translating to where we need to the center, and we're making our XY position the center of our glyph, and then we're just moving from there. Drawing our lines forward and backward. Now we're going to make a circle or a square in the very center. So we're going to use, I think, half the distance. We're translating to the center, and we're going to use half the distance of a quad from the center to half the distance past the center. So that's why those variables are there like that. Now let's make a big circle that fills the entire inside of the glyph. This is going to do that. Now we want triangles to be in the last zone here, so let's take a look at the zones again. Zone C is going to be filled with triangles. The triangle's base width takes up the 2 quads, or 2 squares, and its height takes up just 1. And this is how we draw the triangle. Just trust me on this. You can copy these 4 triangles again and then make them point inward instead of outward, which I've done here, but I haven't changed the coordinates. They're still outward pointing triangles. So that might be an exercise for you to do if you want to make the triangles be inward pointing. But the last 4 style elements are just duplicates of these triangles here. So there's the top facing one. So we had to do a little bit of changing the translation. So see the top one, it's a negative. The bottom one, it's a positive. And then you just switch these. You see how these are switched around. Same with the left and right. We're just basically switching negatives and positives to get things to go where they need to be. And then there's the inward triangle. So this might be an exercise for you to figure out how to get these triangles to point inward. In the process, you may understand how to use triangles better. Okay, so those are all of the conditions that handle how to make a style element. From a top, from the border lines all the way to the triangles that point outward, and some that could point inward if you want to change those. So next we want to create the function that will fill these objects in whatever way we want them to. So let's we're dropping out of the show function. So all of this is inside show. I think this is the end bracket for that. So we're going to be outside show, but we're still inside our function that makes the glyphs. We're going to make another function called this.fillet. And we don't need to pass anything into that function. Fillet's pretty simple. It's going to have some default fillet values, and then if we need to have any randomness, we'll just change whatever these defaults are. We'll take 5% of our glyph size will be its stroke weight, and we need a condition here with a random number. And if it's less than 75% of the time, we're going to make a stroke that's black. And we're going to make a fill that's black. And the other percent of the time, 25% of the time, it's going to be a fill that's black. And the stroke will be the default. You can mess around with those and get whatever kind of variety you want. I move this up here so I can read the inevitable error statement that I'm going to get because I've mistyped something somewhere. Okay, so here's our glyphs being made. Are you guys getting the same output? So far it looks like everything's being made correctly. We've got geometries on the corners. Our triangles are where they need to be. Things are filled and not filled, outlined and not outlined. We've got our big circle. Nothing seems to be hanging out or mispositioned anywhere. So there we go. Let's speed this up and see what happens. So that would be, we'll just comment out this and play it. And there you go. And it stopped when it got to the end. So we can take this out and just have it run back over the top of what's there. There you go. Or we could just have it clear out what's there when it gets down to the bottom. I like it when it leaves it there and it just runs over the top. I kind of like that. Now we can change the density of things just by doing this here. You can see how they're a little bit more dense now. Or we can take that down to where they're really sparse. So there you go, Glyphmaker. One of the things that you might want to do is change the size of the glyphs, make them really small, and then put lots of them on the screen and see what patterns you can get to come up, like maybe use Perlin noise to decide what the densities are and associate it with its position on the screen so that you can get this kind of cloud 3D noise effect. Okay, so let me just roll through this program one more time so you guys can see. I know that this is sometimes an issue where it's just not working and you can't figure out why. Here you go. Just slow this down, pause on the part that you need to check out. And that's how you get that done. Did I scroll past that too fast? Okay, top triangle. All right. Sorry. I'm trying to do this expeditiously, but at the same time give you enough time to be able to tell where you're at. That is a lot of style elements. You might not want to use that many. Just to keep things simpler, you might want to add 10 more. So you're free to do that. You can kind of see the process. And if you want to add style elements, it's just simply a matter of adding another conditional statement here and upping the size of your initial array. So let's go up here to the very beginning of right here. See where it says 25? Just change that loop value and that'll be sure to create the array for all of the style elements that you have. Okay, and did I rush past the bottom? Did you guys get to see the bottom? I feel like I rushed past it. There's fillet, there's random parts. B. All right. Wow, that was a lot. Thanks for sticking with me for this. I hope you've typed this program out and it's worked for you and you're inspired to do all kinds of crazy stuff with this. If you have, leave me a like and all of that extra stuff. And my voice is almost worn out from this video, so I'm going to call it an end. Thanks for joining me, and as always, until next time, take care.